Hello everyone, welcome to part 3 of my Let's Make a Quilt series, and we're making cosmic feathers. It's time to get our quilt ready to be quilted. So the very first thing that I need to do is load a background onto my long arm quilting machine. So as you can see, there's not a whole lot of room in my room for my long arm, but it works. So what I am doing right now is maybe not the way other long armors do it. You might be a long armor and looking at this going, that's interesting. Yeah, so normally you don't do it like this, but okay, what I'm doing is I'm attaching the quilt back to the back leader. I have an extra long leader. I use sew type magnets, so I'm able to just kind of load it up to the back of the machine. Then I have to, well, I do kind of smooth it out, make sure that it's going to go nice and even, and I stop just a little bit before it gets to the edge of this front bar, which is called the belly bar. So now what I'm doing is I'm going to go through and attach all of my red snappers to the backing. Then I'm going to go through and roll and transfer the quilt back from the back leader to the belly bar because it's going to move kind of like backwards. So it needs to be on the front so it can move towards the back. Then once that was done, I went and I grabbed my quilt. I grabbed a tape measure and I measured out what the width of my quilt is going to be because now I need to go and get some batting. You see me doing some math. Basically, I need to add 4 inches so I can have a little, like 2 extra inches of batting on each side. I have my batting on a roll, so I left to go and cut it. I'm going to move my quilt top. I'm going to put the batting down, and then I'm going to put the quilt on top of that. And then it is going to be ready to go, so I will be able to just start quilting. Loading the quilt, all in all, took 24 minutes. I forgot, the last thing I needed to do was pick out some thread color. So you see me, it's called pooling some thread on the top of the quilt. Basically, you can look at the spool and see the color, but it's not going to come out like that on the quilt. So basically, this is what it will look like. It'll just kind of, we go to just kind of drop some thread on top of the quilt top to see what will it look like when it actually stitches out. So I decided to go with peach, so I was putting everything else away and then getting my peach loaded on to a bobbin. Then I was going to go and start basting my quilt top down. So this is what is called a plumb line, where you just do one straight line all the way across, and then with that line I'm able to take my quilt top and baste the top of it to, you know, kind of like have a line to line up to make sure that the top of my quilt is going to be straight. So now I'm going through and I'm going to actually choose my design. So this is called, is it oysters? Oyster shells? I can't remember. But it looks kind of like how Tara does some of her quilting. It's nowhere near, obviously, you can't beat her hand quilting, but it reminded me of it and I thought it would be kind of a nice complement to this pattern. So I'm going through right now. I figured out the width of my quilt and now I'm going to figure out the height and how many times do I need to have this quilt pattern repeat itself as it goes through the quilt. So here I'm just kind of nuzzling, nesting it together a little bit, and now I'm just going to repeat it all the way through. Make sure I have some overhang to make sure that, you know, all of the quilt will be quilted. And so here I'm going to just kind of move it around, make sure that I have some outside of each edge, and then I'm going to crop it to kind of like seal it up so it's not going to quilt outside of the quilt. I went through to see the stitch stats to see how long it was going to take to quilt, and based on that time I thought I would need a second bobbin. I said I might need a third, but I didn't think much of a third. We'll come back to that. But now it's time to load up my bobbin thread. I put that in and also do the top thread. So just kind of go through, load it up, you know, as you do any sewing machine. My tip here is someone once told me that if you put your finger behind the eye of the needle, it makes it easier for you to like thread the needle. I thought that was really cool, and that is how I always thread my needles now. It's just super rad. I love it. Total time to prep the quilt was 15 minutes. So then it's time to let the machine do all of the amazing work that it does. Go through, I like to just kind of watch it, make sure that it's going to like, you know, do its thing. And then the quilt advances and I get to move all that, reset it, it goes through, does its thing, reset it, advance it, everything else. So here I changed the angle because I thought it would be kind of fun. And then I ran out of bobbin. So I was like, oh, cool, I can kind of look at that. Not a problem when this happens. I just back up a few stitches, make sure it locks in, and then I'm able to trim it and it is good to go. So now the bobbin has been switched over and it's just gonna keep quilting. And here I'm kind of trimming up the threads and letting it keep going. So then here the top thread broke, it got caught, and so again, it's not a problem. Just rethread it, put it through and back it up a couple stitches, and then it's good to go. I stay with the quilt most of the time, but when I get down to this bottom row, I'm kind of holding down the bottom just in case it wants to get weird or come up. I sometimes baste it, but this is the method that I prefer. So, you know, I just do what works for me. The total quilting time was 2 hours and 1 minute, which takes our new time working on this quilt to 14 hours and 18 minutes. Okay, so I like to do this rough cut trim off the frame. When I am like finished with a quilt and I have all these extras, I never know what to do with them. And I think what I used to do was just do like cut with my ruler and my rotary cutter. But then I had like quilt or like fabric that was quilted and fabric that was not quilted. It was just kind of weird. And so I think I thought maybe if I had the fabric that didn't have the thread that had already been quilted on it, I would be more inclined to do it. But I just kind of put it in a box of scraps and I'll say, I'll use this one day. And I still haven't. But that's okay. One day I will, right? Of course. So trimming off the frame took 9 minutes. So we're now at 14 hours, 27 minutes. But then I do need to square up the quilt. It was hard getting an angle with this, so I'm sorry, it is kind of weird. I typically like to square up starting from the top, just because I know that is like my straightest of straight lines. And then I just kind of walk it around and go through all of the other sides. They're all different ways to square up a quilt. Some people like to find a line like a border and then measure from there. Some people just like to leave it on the edge. It is whatever makes sense to you and whatever works for you. And that's what's so nice is that, you know, we can all kind of do our own thing. So yeah, squaring up the quilt, 11 minutes, 14 hours and 38 minutes. Oh, the other thing I did here, I took the basting stitches out because they were kind of getting caught and that was annoying. Time to cut some binding. I had no idea how I was going to bind this quilt, but then I found this this was me looking through and being like, should I use something like my leftover binding spool? And I couldn't find anything, but I found this pretty teal from Jolly Darlings, and I was like, well, I thought about quilting it in kind of a teal, so why don't I just use this for binding? So again, Stripology ruler to the rescue. Cut my binding strips. That took all of 4 minutes. Now it's time to actually attach the binding together, make the binding. So I just went through with I was changing out my foot, 1/4 inch foot without a guide, put all my strips corner to corner, make sure that the selvage is always on the top and the right, and then do my straight lines. You can see I have my diagonal seam tape that I'm using, really helpful in this process. So just kind of going through, making sure that it's all going to be good. Clip up my chain piecing, trim off my edges, and then I'm going to use my little bias tape maker. Okay, so this bias tape maker is seriously so cool. I think my mother-in-law got it for me in like 2012, and I love it so much. So first thing, I trim off a little bit of a edge so I can feed it into the tape maker, and then take a look. I just have to press it down, and then it's gonna lovingly feed it through. And I just gotta, you know, kind of pull it when it reaches the seams, make sure it doesn't get twisted, make sure it has enough room. But then that's how I can make my binding super, super fast. And now it is ready to attach. Oh, well, no, hold on. First, I attach it to this little binding buddy that my husband 3D printed for me, which is so nice and easy to use. I love it so much. I can just wind my binding on it, and then it just sits right next to my machine. So as I'm binding, it is just, you know, right there, just twirling all along. Changing my foot to my 1/4 inch foot, putting everything on the side of my table away so I have plenty of room to attach my binding. Okay, so when I attach my binding, I feel like I almost always forget to go to the back first, but luckily today was a good day and I knew exactly what to do. So I'm just kind of dropping that binding onto the quilt, lining it up on the edge. I've got my 1/4 inch foot on there. And just going through, you know, attaching it. When I get to the corner, I do all those mitered corner tricks, you know, kind of stop a little bit ahead and then go off to the side, bring it out, have him kiss, switch it around, and what am I trying to say? Here we go, binding, and then, you know, just keep going. When I make my binding, I feel like I always start kind of close-ish to a corner, and it's so I can, I know when I pass that 3rd corner, I'm ready to just kind of go. So what did I do there? I cut off a strip, a really thin strip of my binding, because that was 2.5 inches, so that I could pull down, and it would show me exactly where to cut to make sure that I had the right size. So now I trimmed up my quilt, I trimmed up my binding, excuse me. I sewed it corner to corner again, and I just made sure that it was going to lay flush, and then I finished attaching it. So now I'm going to go through and move over to the front. I changed my foot. I'm not quite sure what type of foot this is, but basically it has like a metal line in the middle. And so what I do is I make sure that my binding kind of is just to the right of that metal bar. And then I move my needle over a little bit so it's to the right of the bar. And that is my favorite binding trick. I am very lucky with my machine to where I don't have to use a walking foot when I attach my binding. I can just use my regular feet. It is powerful enough to just kind of move through. So I'm really lucky in that regard. I know some people, like on my older machine, I used to have to use a walking foot, and the walking feet never did kind of what I wanted it to do to help me with binding. So when I figured out I could just use regular feet, it was great. But yeah, just doing the binding, tucking it in, doing a little bit of it at a time. I slow down my machine because I am a pedal to the floor kind of person, sewist, quilter. And when I get to that corner, just, you know, go slowly, back it up, turn the corner, and then just keep going. So here we go. Making and attaching the binding, 55 minutes, bring our total time in making this quilt to 15 hours, 37 minutes. From ironing the very first fabrics to finishing off the binding. And I love this quilt. I cannot wait to make it again. It is a beautiful make, a breeze to make, and it's just, I can't wait. I hope that you enjoy it as well.